Hey friends, Miss Patrick here. We're finishing chapter 5. We stopped right in the middle of the chapter, so we're picking up right where we left off. So exactly 2,379,152,497 years, 8 months and 3 days. That is according to your calendar, of course, which even you know isn't very accurate. She leaned in closer to Meg and Calvin and whispered, "It really was a very great honor for me to be chosen for this mission. It's just because of my verbalizing and materializing so well, you know. But of course, we can't take any credit for our talents. It's how we use them that counts. And I make far too many mistakes. That's why Mrs. Who and I enjoy seeing Mrs. Witch make a mistake when she tried to land you on a two-dimensional planet. It was that we were laughing at. It was that we were laughing at, not you. She was laughing at herself, you see. She's really terribly nice to us younger ones." Meg was listening with such interest to Mrs. Whatsit was saying that she hardly noticed when they went into the cave. The transition from the grayness of the outside to the grayness of inside was almost unnoticeable. She saw a flickering light ahead of them, ahead and down. It was towards this that they went. As they drew closer, she realized that it was a fire. "It's very cold in here," Mrs. Whatsit said, "so we have asked her to have a good bonfire going for you." As they approached the fire, they could see a dark shadow against it. And as they went closer, they still could see that the shadow was a woman. She wore a turban of a beautiful pale mauve silk and a long flowing purple satin. In her hands was a crystal ball, into which she was gazing rapidly. She did not appear to see the children, Mrs. Whatsit, Mrs. Who, and Mrs. Witch, but continued to stare into the crystal ball, and as she stared, she began to laugh. And she laughed and laughed at whatever it was that she was seeing. Mrs. Witch's voice rang out clear and strong, echoing against the walls of the cavern, and the words fell with a sonorous clang. "We're here." The woman looked up from the ball, and when she saw them, she got up and curtsied deeply. Mrs. Whatsit and Mrs. Who dropped small curtsies in return, and the shimmer seemed and the sh- yeah, sorry, and the shimmer seemed to bow slightly. "Oh, medium dear," Mrs. Whatsit said, "these are the children. Charles Wallace Murray." Charles Wallace bowed. "Margaret Murray." Meg felt that if Mrs. Whatsit and Mrs. Who had curtsied, she ought to too. Also, she did, rather awkwardly. "And Calvin O'Keefe." Calvin bobbed his head. "We want them to see their home planet," Mrs. Whatsit said. The medium lost the delight smile she had worn until then. "Oh, why must you make me look into an unpleasant thing when when there are so many delightful ones to see?" Again, Mrs. Witch's voice reverberated throughout the cave. "There will no longer be so many pleasant things to look at if responsible people do not do something about the unpleasant ones." The medium sighed and held the ball high. "Look, children," Mrs. Whatsit said, "look into the well." Oh, she's speaking a different language here. And then she says, "Delil, how small the earth is to him who looks from heaven." Mrs. Who intoned musically. Meg looked into the crystal ball, at first with caution, then with increasing eagerness, as she seemed to see an enormous sweep of dark and empty space, and then galaxies swinging across it. Finally, they seemed to move in closer, one of the galaxies. "Your own Milky Way," Mrs. Whatsit whispered to Meg. They were headed directly towards the center of the galaxy when they moved off to one side. Stars seemed to be rushing at them. Meg flung her arms up over her face as though to ward off the blow. "Look," Mrs. Witch commanded. Meg dropped her arm. They seemed to be moving in towards a planet. She thought she could make out the polar ice caps. Everything seemed sparkling clear. "No, no, medium dear. That's Mars, Mrs. Whatsit reproved gently. Do I have to? The medium asked. Now, Mrs. Witch commanded. The bright planet moved out of their vision. For a moment, there was the darkness of space, then another planet. The outlines of this planet were not clean and clear. It seemed to be covered with a smoky haze. Through the haze, Meg thought she could make out familiar outlines of continents like pictures in her social studies books. Is it because our atmosphere that we can't see properly? She asked anxiously. No, Meg. You know that is not the atmosphere, Mrs. Witch said. You must be brave. It's the thing, Charles Wallace cried. It's the dark thing we saw from the mountain peak on Uriel when we were riding on Mrs. Whatsit's back. Did it just come? Meg asked in agony, unable to take her eyes from the sickness of the shadow which darkened the beauty of the earth. Did it just come while we've been gone? Mrs. Witch's voice seemed very tired. Tell her, she said to Mrs. Whatsit. Mrs. Whatsit sighed. No, Meg, it hasn't just come. It's been here for a great many years. That is why your planet is such a troubled one. But why? Calvin started to ask, his voice croaking hoarsely. Mrs. Whatsit raised her hand to silence him. We showed you the dark thing on Uriel first. Oh, for many reasons. First, because the atmosphere on the mountain peaks there were so clear and thin, you could see it for what it is. And we thought it would be easier for you to understand it if you saw it. Well, someplace else first, not your own Earth. I hate it, Charles Wallace cried passionately. I hate the dark thing. Mrs. Whatsit nodded. Yes, Charles dear, we all do. That's another reason we wanted to prepare you on Uriel. We thought it would be too frightening for you to see it, first of all, on your own beloved world. But what is it? Calvin demanded. We know that it's evil, but what is it? You have said it, Mrs. Witch's voice rang out. It is evil. It is the powers of darkness. But what's going to happen? Meg's voice trembled. Oh, please, Mrs. Witch, tell us what's going to happen. We will continue to fight. Something in Mrs. Witch's voice made all three of the children stand straighter, throwing back their shoulders with determination, looking at the glimmer that was Mrs. Witch with pride and confidence. And we're not alone, you know, children, came Mrs. Whatsit, the comforter. All through the universe, it's being fought. All through the cosmos, but it's a grand and exciting battle. I know it's hard for you to understand about size, how there's very little difference in size in the tiniest microbe in the greatest galaxy. You think about that, and maybe it won't seem strange to you that some of our very best fighters have come right from your own planet. And it's a little planet, dears, out on the edge of the little galaxy. You can be proud that it's done so well. Who have our fighters been? Calvin asked. Oh, you must know them, dear, Mrs. Whatsit said. Mrs. Who's spectacles shone out at them triumphantly. And the light shineth in the darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not. Jesus? Charles Wallace asked. Why, of course, Jesus. Of course, Mrs. Whatsit said. Go on, Charles love. There were others, all of your great artists. They've been lights for us to see by. Leonardo da Vinci, Calvin suggested tentatively, and Michelangelo? And Shakespeare, Charles Wallace called out, and Bach, and Pasteur, and Madame Curie, and Einstein. Now Calvin's voice rang with confidence. And Schweitzer, and Gandhi, and Buddha, and Beethoven, and Rembrandt, and St. Francis. Now you, Meg, Mrs. Whatsit ordered. Oh, Euclid, I suppose? Meg was in such an agony of impatience that her voice grated irritably. And Copernicus? But what about Father? Please, what about Father? We are going to your father, Mrs. Witch said. But where is he? Meg went over to Mrs. Witch and stamped as though she were as young as Charles Wallace. Mrs. Whatsit answered in a voice that was low but quite firm. On a planet that is given in, so you must prepare to be very strong. All traces of cheer had left the happy medium's face. She sat holding the great ball, looking down at the shadowed earth, and a slow tear coursed down her cheek. A slow tear coursed down her cheek. I can't stand it any longer, she sobbed. Watch now, children. Watch. That's the end of chapter 5. Chapter 6 coming up next.